Well, the definition of vernacular art is, it's a little sketchy, but the short answer is that vernacular art is art made by artists who are untrained, so they haven't received any formal training. They're self-educated artists.
I think in some cases, some of them wouldn't have considered themselves artists. They were just individuals that were driven to express themselves or to make things that their children could use as toys or that they could have in their homes.
Vernacular art relates to a strong sense of place, and in fact the word vernacular in architecture and in linguistics, that's closer to its meaning, is a sense of place, something that's particular to a sense of place. So obviously here it's the prairies.
People like Fred Moulding, he started making small models of horses and threshing machines, and he tried to make them as accurate as possible. So even though they were small and toy-like, they actually would have all the parts that, you know, a threshing machine would actually have. I think he saw it as a way of capturing the history of the province.
There's also a little back and forth around vernacular art and the place of folk artists. And so in this exhibition we've used the term folk artists a lot because that's what people are really familiar with.
Traditional folk art would be like quilts, wood carving, making whirligigs. Those have been going on, you know, for centuries and would have started in the prairies when people immigrated. But what we've focused on here in this exhibition is what's kind of described as contemporary folk art, like painting and sculpture, drawings. It's sort of based more in fine arts rather than so much craft. As you can see in the exhibition, there's lots of color and most of the work is very playful in a way. A lot of it can embrace a real kind of joy of life. Here we're looking at a piece by Harbus called 10 Weddings. She's actually collapsing time and space in this one work. So they didn't all happen at once on one day. This was 10 weddings that happened over course of a number of years. So they're weddings of her children and her grandchildren. She's referencing the town that she was living in, but also you see she's written on that building Saskatoon. So I think she's referencing how spread out her family is and just referencing a lot of different memories in one picture. Elements here typical of some folk art. There's a real variance in scale throughout the image. Here you've got these really large vehicles that are somewhat like almost as large as the building here, and a real variance in perspective as well.
Some of the artists in this exhibition started making art in the 1920s. I mean, there's a few who were making art starting as children, but as adults, probably the earliest would be the 1920s, and I think full power kind of thing in the 40s and 50s in terms of the historical artists.
Predominantly, a lot of folk art shows will focus on settler culture or pioneer history, and so we wanted to include Indigenous voices so that it gave an alternate sense of history of the prairies. What motivated a lot of folk artists to do is capture their memories and stories of life growing up. And so this is life growing up on Red Pheasant Reserve. And the interesting thing is he's created it like a various collage of images all in one canvas, where you can see multiple perspectives of life, both indoors and outdoors, and winter and in summer. Alan Sapp is an Indigenous artist from Red Pheasant First Nation. I don't know if he's always been regarded as a folk artist. He was self-taught, so he definitely fits into the parameters of this exhibition, and they're really lovely visual narratives of life on a First Nation. Frank Sikanski was an immigrant from Romania. He was trained as a blacksmith and a wheelwright. After he retired, he started painting memories of the Depression years, like trying to establish himself here and the hardships that he saw. So he's got paintings of people abandoning their farms and fields covered in grasshoppers and dead horses and cattle lying out in the fields. He actually incorporated text, which is really fascinating. So he would write on some of his canvases, "Please give me water or I'll die," to reference how the wells had run dry during the Depression. There's sort of a rawness to his work. There's also sort of an element of abstraction. Things are simplified. You've got things with heavy outlines. The way the paint is applied is just it's very loose, it's very gestural, almost like he's just trying to create a visual story.
My dad was a great storyteller. And when he told stories, he always drew a picture being chased by the wolves in the Carpathian Mountains, for example. He kept a whole book of every project that he did. His memory was so sharp, even in his 80s. You know, he said, I built a house for so-and-so for $200, paid me not a nickel, crook. You know, and he'd draw a picture of him, you know, and crook written in big letters on the paper, you know. We were a family of makers. My dad was always working and making and creating things. Every house we ever lived in, he built. I worked with him in his shop, so I was always using my hands. He would do things like nail a piece of board on a sawhorse and then mark it off with a pencil and then give me a little saw. And then he told me, now you cut each of these off. And I'd be maybe 8 or 9 years old. So I'm cutting away until I cut them all off. And then he picked them up and he said, now what are you going to do with them? And I said, I'll make a birdhouse. The craftsmanship and the ability to work, it's still part of my life today.
Earlier vernacular artists had a strong connection, primarily through Regina, to artists like David Thauberger and Joe Fafard, Vic Sikanski, Russell Uristy, and almost in a way legitimized those artists' sense of how important a sense of place is.
Here we're looking at a painting by Eva Dennis. It's based on her memory of teaching at a one-room schoolhouse near Old Wives Lake. This is a great example of basically sourcing their own memories, trying to capture a point in time that's not forgotten. What's interesting here, you can see that she's really pushed the schoolhouse forward again in the picture plane and simplified the form of it so that it looks quite flattened. And this is, again, an approach that you would see in work like David Thauberger.
I knew many of those artists and spent time with them, and we became friends. So it's like they're alive and present in the exhibition again. I remember sitting in Wesley Dennis's living room and talking with he and Eva about their paintings. I remember up in the tiny little bedroom that McCargler kind of was relegated to for his paintings, and seeing the paintings all stacked up floor to ceiling. I remember visiting Molly Lenhart. She worked in a small convenience store in the back in a little room. She again would paint because they kept the store open late at night for the railway workers who would come in and want tobacco and milk and bread and so forth. And so those long winter nights when not much was going on and it was 30 below, she would be back there painting, right? And all these things will sort of come flooding back to you when you see pictures that you, again, haven't seen in years.
Folk artists provided a context for making work about this place. They set the foundation for that practice of making work about what you know and where you come from, and that it was relevant to contemporary art. This set a good foundation for the generation of artists that came out of the 1970s.
If you have program ideas that you'd like to see on Max TV Local On Demand, write us at max.local@sasktel.com.